You think fashion today is weird? Wait until you see what people wore in the Middle Ages. We're talking about shoes so long they had to be tied to your knees, hats with actual horns, and men strutting around in bright-colored tights showing off their legs like they were on a runway. But here's the thing, these weren't just random crazy choices. Every single one of these bizarre fashion trends had a purpose, and some of them were literally deadly. I'm talking about sleeves so long they caught fire, shoes so pointy they were banned by law, and beauty standards so extreme that women would shave off their hairlines to look fashionable. The Middle Ages, roughly spanning from the 5th to the 15th centuries, was a time when your clothing didn't just cover your body, it screamed your social status to everyone around you. Rich people didn't just want to look good, they wanted to look so outrageously different from poor people that there was no way anyone could mistake their wealth. And they were willing to go to absolutely insane lengths to make that happen. Picture this, you're walking through a medieval town, and you see a man hobbling down the street in shoes so long and pointy that he literally cannot walk normally. His toes are crammed into a shoe that extends 2 feet beyond his actual foot. This isn't some costume party or joke. This is Tuesday in medieval Europe, and this guy is dressed normally for someone of his social class. But the men weren't the only ones dealing with impractical fashion. Women were walking around with cone-shaped hats so tall they had to duck through doorways, sleeves so long they dragged on the ground collecting dirt and sometimes catching fire, and they were literally shaving off parts of their hair to achieve what they thought was the perfect forehead shape. And here's what's really wild, a lot of these fashion trends weren't just uncomfortable or impractical. Some of them were genuinely dangerous. People died because of their clothing choices. Others were arrested or fined by the government for wearing the wrong type of shoe. Fashion police was a real thing, and they had actual legal power. The craziest part, rich people loved it. The more impractical and over-the-top their clothing was, the better. Because if you could afford to wear something that made it impossible to do any actual work, that meant you were rich enough that you didn't have to work. Your clothing was a walking advertisement that you had servants to do everything for you. So we're going to dive deep into the 10 most bizarre fashion trends from medieval times. Some of these will make you laugh, others will make you cringe, and a few might actually shock you with how far people were willing to go in the name of fashion. We'll explore why these trends started, how they evolved, and what they tell us about medieval society and human nature in general. Trust me, by the end of this, you'll never complain about uncomfortable shoes or weird fashion trends again. Because compared to what people put themselves through in the Middle Ages, modern fashion is basically comfort wear. Before we jump into the specific trends, we need to understand the fundamental problem that drove all of medieval fashion. Social hierarchy was everything, but it wasn't always obvious who belonged where just by looking at them. In medieval society, your social class determined everything about your life. Where you lived, what you ate, who you could marry, what jobs you could have, even how you were punished if you broke the law. But unlike today where we have designer labels and luxury brands that clearly signal wealth, medieval people had to get creative about showing their status. The problem was that basic clothing, tunics, dresses, cloaks, looked pretty similar whether you were rich or poor. Sure, rich people might have better fabric or more decoration, but from a distance, it was hard to tell who was who. And in a society where showing proper respect to your social superiors was literally a matter of life and death, people needed a way to make their status unmistakably clear. This created what historians call conspicuous consumption, the idea that rich people need to waste resources in obvious ways to prove they have resources to waste. And medieval fashion took this concept to absolutely insane extremes. The other problem was that medieval society was becoming more complex. You had the traditional nobility, but also wealthy merchants, successful craftsmen, church officials, court officials, and various other groups who had money but weren't necessarily born into the aristocracy. Everyone was trying to climb the social ladder, and fashion became one of the main ways to do it. This led to what we might call an arms race of fashion. If pointy shoes showed you were wealthy, then someone else would make their shoes even more pointy. If tall hats indicated status, then hats got taller and taller until they became almost architectural structures. Each generation pushed these trends further and further, till they reached levels that seem completely insane to us today. The church tried to stop some of these trends by preaching against vanity and excessive clothing, but that often just made the trends more popular among the wealthy, who saw it as a way to rebel against religious authority while showing off their wealth at the same time. Governments tried to regulate fashion through what were called sumptuary laws, basically dress codes that legally required people to dress according to their social class. But these laws were often ignored or found ways around them. and enforcement was spotty at best. So with that background, let's dive into the specific trends that show just how far medieval people were willing to go in the name of fashion and status. Number 1. Pointy shoes that never ended. Let's start with probably the most iconic bizarre fashion trend of the Middle Ages, shoes so pointy that they extended far beyond the actual human foot. We're not talking about a little point at the toe. We're talking about shoes that could extend 2 feet or more beyond where your toes actually end. These shoes were called polanes, and they dominated European fashion for over 2 centuries. The basic concept was simple: the longer and pointier your shoes, the higher your social status. But the execution was absolutely wild. Picture trying to walk in shoes where the toe section is longer than your entire foot. The point was so long that it had to be stuffed with materials like moss, hair, or wool to keep its shape. The most extreme versions had toes that were so long they had to be attached to the wearer's leg with chains or cords just so they wouldn't drag on the ground or get caught on things. The longest recorded polanes had toes that extended up to 2.5 feet beyond the wearer's actual foot. That means if you wore a size 10 shoe normally, your polane might be over 3 feet long total. Try to imagine walking downstairs or through a doorway in shoes like that. But here's the thing, the difficulty was the whole point. If you could afford to wear shoes that made walking a challenge, that meant you were wealthy enough that you didn't need to do much walking. You had servants to carry you, or horses to ride, or at the very least, you weren't doing any manual labor that required normal mobility. The trend started in the 14th century and was inspired by shoes worn in Poland, hence the name polanes, which comes from Poland. But like many fashion trends, what started as a subtle style choice quickly escalated to ridiculous extremes. By the 15th century, polanes had become so extreme that they were causing actual problems. People couldn't walk properly, couldn't climb stairs safely, and couldn't even kneel down to pray in church without their shoes getting in the way. The shoes were also incredibly expensive because they required so much extra material and specialized craftsmanship. The construction of these shoes was an engineering challenge. Shoemakers had to figure out how to make the extended toe portion hold its shape while still being somewhat flexible. They experimented with different stuffing materials, internal supports, and attachment methods. Some shoes had wire frames inside the toe to keep them pointed upward. Others used whalebone or other rigid materials. The really wealthy would have their polanes decorated with jewels, embroidery, or metalwork. Some had bells attached to the tips that would jingle as the wearer walked. Others had carved designs or painted decorations that turned the shoes into works of art. But the shoes weren't just uncomfortable. They were actually dangerous. There are recorded cases of people tripping over their own shoes and falling down stairs or into fires. The long toes could get caught in clothing, stirrups, or doorways, causing accidents. In battle, soldiers wearing polanes were at a significant disadvantage because they couldn't move quickly or change direction easily. The church condemned polanes as vanity and excess, arguing that they were a sign of moral corruption. Preachers would deliver sermons specifically attacking pointy shoes, saying they were inspired by the devil. Some claimed that the pointed toes were actually meant to resemble the devil's horns. But the real backlash came from governments. By the late 14th century, several European countries had passed laws specifically regulating the length of shoe toes. In England, there were laws stating that commoners couldn't wear shoes with toes longer than 6 inches, while nobility could wear longer ones. France had similar laws with different restrictions for different social classes. The most extreme anti-polane legislation came from various city governments. Some cities banned pointy shoes entirely, while others limited the length based on the wearer's social status or wealth. There are records of people being fined or even imprisoned for wearing shoes that were too long for their social class. Despite all the opposition, polanes remained popular for over 200 years. They only finally went out of style in the late 15th century when broader changes in society and fashion made them seem outdated. The Renaissance brought new ideals about clothing and status that moved away from the extreme impracticality of medieval fashion. But even as polanes disappeared, they left a lasting impact on European culture. They became a symbol of medieval excess and impracticality, referenced in literature and art for centuries afterward. Shakespeare mentioned them in his plays as examples of foolish vanity. The polane trend also established patterns that would influence fashion for centuries. The idea that discomfort and impracticality could be signs of wealth and status, that fashion should push boundaries and cause controversy, and that what seems normal to one generation can seem completely insane to the next. Archaeological evidence shows just how widespread polanes were. Excavations of medieval sites across Europe regularly turn up examples of these shoes, from simple versions worn by merchants to elaborate decorated examples that must have belonged to the very wealthy. The fact that so many have survived suggests they were built to last, which makes sense given how expensive they were to make. Interestingly, polanes also influenced other aspects of medieval culture. The pointed toe shape appeared in architecture, decorative arts, and even weapons design. It became a general aesthetic that was associated with sophistication and high status across many different areas of life. The social dynamics around polanes were complex. While they were primarily a male fashion trend, women also wore pointed shoes, though usually not to the same extreme lengths. The gendered aspects of the trend reflected broader ideas about masculinity and display in medieval culture. There were also regional variations in how polanes developed. Italian versions tended to be slightly more restrained than English or French ones. German polanes often featured different decorative elements. These regional differences show how the basic trend was adapted to local tastes and social conditions. The craftsmanship required to make extreme polanes was extraordinary. Master shoemakers developed techniques that wouldn't be out of place in modern engineering. They had to understand weight distribution, structural integrity, material science, and ergonomics, all without any of the theoretical knowledge that modern designers take for granted. The economic impact of polanes was significant. Entire workshops were devoted to producing them, creating employment for skilled craftsmen, decorators, and support staff. The trend also drove innovation in related industries, better dyes for coloring, new metalworking techniques for decorations, and improved methods for producing the specialty materials used in construction. But perhaps most importantly, polanes represent one of the clearest examples of how fashion can become completely disconnected from function. These shoes served no practical purpose whatsoever. They actually made every aspect of daily life more difficult. Yet they remained popular for centuries because their impracticality was exactly what made them valuable as status symbols. The psychology behind polanes tells us something fundamental about human nature and social competition. The willingness to accept significant inconvenience and even danger in order to display status is a pattern that appears throughout human history in different forms. Medieval polanes were just one particularly extreme example of this universal tendency. Number 2. Horns on women's hats. While men were dealing with impossible shoes, women had their own bizarre fashion challenge, hats that looked like they belonged on mythical creatures rather than human heads. We're talking about the hennin, a cone-shaped hat that could reach heights of over 3 feet and often featured horn-like projections that made women look like they were cosplaying as unicorns or devils. The hennin emerged in the 15th century and quickly became the must-have accessory for wealthy women across Europe. But calling it just a hat doesn't really capture how extreme these things were. Imagine wearing a traffic cone on your head, except the cone is made of expensive fabric, decorated with jewels and embroidery, and extends so high that you have to duck through doorways and can't ride in normal carriages. The basic hennin was cone-shaped, but there are many variations. Some had 2 points instead of 1, creating a horn-like appearance that earned them the nickname horned hennins. Others had flowing veils or fabric that extended even further from the cone, creating a silhouette that was almost architectural in its boldness. The construction of a hennin was an engineering project. The base was usually made from buckram, a stiff fabric that could hold its shape, or sometimes from actual cardboard-like materials. This base was then covered with expensive fabrics like silk, velvet, or brocade. The whole structure had to be carefully balanced so it wouldn't topple over when the wearer moved her head. But here's where it gets really wild. The taller your hennin, the more fashionable you were considered. This led to an escalating competition among wealthy women to see who could wear the most impractically tall hat. Some hennins reached heights of over a yard, making the wearer nearly 7 feet tall when standing upright. The social rules around hennins were strict and complex. Only married women of high social status were supposed to wear them, and the height and decoration of your hennin had to match your exact place in the social hierarchy. Wearing a hennin that was too fancy for your station could result in social disgrace or even legal punishment under sumptuary laws. The practical problems with hennins were enormous. Women couldn't walk through normal doorways without removing their hats or bending over awkwardly. They couldn't ride in carriages unless the carriage was specially modified with a higher roof. They couldn't lie down normally, which meant sleeping required special arrangements. Church attendance became a major issue. Cathedral ceilings were high enough to accommodate hennins, but many smaller churches weren't. Women would have to remove their expensive hats before entering, which defeated much of the purpose of wearing them. Some churches actually had to modify their architecture to accommodate the fashion trend. The veils that often accompanied hennins created additional problems. These veils could be several yards long and required careful management to avoid getting tangled up or caught on things. Some women employed servants whose primary job was managing their mistress's veil and hat ensemble. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of hennins was how they were worn in combination with other medieval beauty standards. Women would pluck their hairlines to create high foreheads that would look proportional under the tall hats. They would also pluck their eyebrows to create the thin, high-arched look that was considered fashionable. The result was a look that seems almost alien to modern eyes. Women with dramatically altered hairlines wearing towering cone-shaped hats that extended 3 feet above their heads, often with flowing veils that trailed behind them. It was a silhouette that emphasized height and drama over any practical concerns. The cost of a proper hennin was enormous. The materials alone could cost more than most people earn in a year, and that's before you factor in the skilled craftsmanship required to construct one properly. Many hennins were decorated with precious metals, gems, pearls, and intricate embroidery that made them essentially wearable works of art. The social pressure to wear hennins was intense among the upper classes. Not wearing one, or wearing one that was considered too modest for your station, could be seen as a sign that your family was experiencing financial difficulties. Women would sometimes bankrupt their families trying to keep up with the latest hennin fashions. There were also strict rules about when and where hennins could be worn. They were primarily for formal occasions and public appearances. Women wouldn't wear them for everyday activities around the house, partly because they were so impractical, but also because they were too valuable to risk damaging. The maintenance requirements for hennins were significant. They had to be stored carefully to maintain their shape, and the fabrics and decorations required regular cleaning and repair. Many wealthy families employed specialists, whose job was maintaining and repairing the family's collection of hennins. The church's reaction to hennins was predictably negative. Preachers condemned them as vanity and excess, and some specifically compared the horned versions to devil worship. There are recorded sermons where priests argued that women wearing horned hennins were literally displaying satanic symbols on their heads. But the religious opposition went beyond just moral objections. The practical problems hennins caused in churches, women unable to fit through doors, unable to kneel properly for prayer, causing disruptions with their elaborate veils, led some churches to ban them entirely. Despite the opposition, hennins remained popular for over a century. They evolved and changed over time, with different regions developing their own variations. Italian hennins tended to be more restrained, while French and Burgundian versions pushed the limits of height and decoration. The decline of hennins came gradually in the late 15th and early 16th centuries as Renaissance ideals about beauty and fashion began to emphasize more natural forms. The new ideals valued harmony and proportion over the dramatic extremes that characterized medieval fashion. But like Polaines, hennins left a lasting cultural impact. They became symbols of medieval excess and the lengths people would go to for fashion. They appear in art and literature for centuries as representations of vanity and impracticality. Archaeological evidence for hennins is limited because they were made mostly from organic materials that don't preserve well. But we have extensive documentation from paintings, manuscripts, and written records that show just how widespread and elaborate these hats became. The social psychology behind hennins is fascinating. They represented a form of conspicuous consumption that was specifically feminine, allowing women to participate in status display in ways that were acceptable within medieval gender roles. At the same time, they reinforced ideas about women as decorative objects whose primary value was their appearance. The technical challenges of wearing hennins were extraordinary. Women had to completely modify their movement patterns, posture, and daily routines to accommodate the hats. Simple activities like getting dressed, eating, or sleeping became complex procedures that required careful planning and often assistance from servants. The international spread of hennin fashion shows how connected medieval European culture was becoming. Styles would travel from court to court through diplomatic marriages, trade relationships, and cultural exchanges. The fact that such an impractical fashion could become popular across multiple countries shows the power of social status competition to override practical concerns. Different regions developed their own distinctive hennin styles that reflected local preferences and social conditions. Burgundian hennins were often the most extreme in height and decoration, reflecting the wealth and extravagance of the Burgundian court. French versions tended to emphasize elegance and refinement. English henins were often more conservative, but still substantial enough to clearly signal high status. The construction techniques for henins drove innovations in textile work and millinery that influenced hat-making for centuries. The methods developed for creating stable, lightweight structures that could support elaborate decorations while remaining wearable laid the groundwork for later developments in fashion construction. The hennin also influenced other aspects of medieval culture beyond fashion. The cone shape appeared in architecture, decorative arts, and even religious symbolism. The dramatic silhouette created by women wearing henins became part of the visual language of medieval high culture, appearing in paintings, sculptures, and illuminated manuscripts as a symbol of nobility and refinement. Number 3. Men wearing bright tights. Now let's talk about one of the most shocking aspects of medieval men's fashion. The fact that displaying your legs in skin-tight, brightly colored hosiery was not only acceptable, but considered the height of masculinity in fashion. We're talking about an era when men strutted around in what were essentially colorful leggings that left absolutely nothing to the imagination. These weren't the dark, conservative tights you might imagine. Medieval men wore hose in colors that would make a modern highlighter jealous: bright reds, electric blues, sunshine yellows, and vivid greens. And they didn't wear just one color either. Fashion demanded that each leg be a different color, creating a look that was bold, attention-grabbing, and completely unapologetic. The fashion trend we're talking about dominated European men's fashion from roughly the 12th to the 16th centuries, with the peak years being the 14th and 15th centuries. During this time, showing off your legs in tight, colorful hose wasn't just acceptable for men, it was a requirement for anyone who wanted to be taken seriously as fashionable and wealthy. But first, let's understand what we're talking about when we say hose. These weren't like modern pantyhose or stockings. Medieval hose were essentially individual leg coverings that extended from the foot all the way up to the waist. They were made from materials like wool, silk, or linen, and they fit so tightly that they showed every contour of the leg and, well, everything else. The construction of medieval hose was incredibly sophisticated. These weren't simply tubes of fabric. They were carefully cut and sewn to follow the exact shape of the leg, with different pieces for the foot, ankle, calf, knee, and thigh. The best hose were custom fitted by skilled craftsmen who would take detailed measurements to ensure a perfect fit. The tightness was crucial to the fashion. Loose or baggy hose were considered sloppy and unfashionable. The goal was to have the fabric follow every muscle and curve of the leg so closely that it was almost like a second skin. This required not only expert construction but also careful maintenance. Hose had to be put on carefully to avoid tears and adjusted regularly to maintain the proper fit. But here's where it gets really interesting: the color combinations. The most fashionable look was called mi-parti or party-colored, where each leg would be a completely different color. So you might have one bright red leg and one bright blue leg, or one yellow leg and one green leg. The more contrasting and bold the colors, the more fashionable you were considered. Some men took this even further by having their hose made in complex patterns or with different colors on different sections of the same leg. You might have a thigh that was red, a knee that was blue, and a foot that was yellow, all on the same leg. The most elaborate examples looked like wearable art projects. The bright colors weren't just for show, they were incredibly expensive to produce. Vivid dyes were luxury items in the medieval world. Bright reds came from crushed insects or expensive mineral compounds. Deep blues required rare and costly materials like lapis lazuli or indigo imported from faraway lands. Wearing bright colors was literally wearing your wealth. The social implications of hose were complex. On one hand, they were clearly a status symbol. Only wealthy men could afford high-quality, brightly colored, perfectly fitted hose. But they also represented a very specific ideal of masculinity that's almost incomprehensible to modern audiences. In medieval thinking, a man's legs were considered one of his most attractive features. Well-shaped calves and thighs were seen as signs of strength, athleticism, and sexual appeal. Hose allowed men to show off their physical attributes in a way that was considered both fashionable and masculine. This created a weird situation where medieval men were essentially wearing what we would consider women's clothing by modern standards, but it was seen as the most masculine fashion choice available. Knights would wear bright, tight hose under their armor. Nobles would wear them to court functions. Merchants would wear them to show their prosperity. The practical aspects of wearing hose were challenging. Getting them on required help from servants or family members, as the tight fit made them difficult to put on alone. They were also fragile, that could tear easily if not handled carefully. Wealthy men would own multiple pairs and change them frequently throughout the day. The length of the hose also varied depending on the style of the moment. Early medieval hose only came up to the knee or mid-thigh, worn with brays, basically medieval underwear, and a tunic that covered the upper legs. But as fashion evolved, hose got longer and longer until they covered the entire leg and were attached to a belt or doublet at the waist. This evolution created some interesting fashion problems. The connection between a hose and the upper body clothing had to be both secure, so the hose wouldn't fall down, and adjustable, so the wearer could move. Various solutions were tried, from laces and ties to hooks and buttons, but it remained a constant engineering challenge. The athletic aspects of hose fashion were significant. Men would often engage in activities specifically designed to show off their legs while wearing fashionable hose. Dancing was particularly popular because it allowed for dynamic movement that would display the legs from multiple angles. Certain court ceremonies and rituals were structured specifically to give men opportunities to show off their hose. But the trend also had its critics. The church condemned tight, colorful hose as vanity and inappropriate display of the male body. Some preachers argued that such revealing clothing was leading men into sin and moral corruption. There are recorded sermons specifically attacking the fashion of colorful hose. Regional variations in hose fashion were significant. Italian hose tended to be more conservatively colored but with more elaborate patterns and decorations. French and Burgundian hose pushed the limits of brightness and color contrast. English hose often featured heraldic designs or family colors that served as a form of identification. The decline of colorful hose fashion came gradually in the 16th century as Renaissance ideals about male fashion began to emphasize more covered, conservative styles. The rise of breeches and longer tunics meant that men's legs became less central to fashionable display. But the impact of medieval hose fashion on our understanding of historical masculinity is significant. It challenges modern assumptions about gender and clothing, showing that ideas about what's masculine or feminine in fashion are highly cultural and time-dependent. Archaeological evidence from medieval hose is limited because textiles rarely survive in good condition. But we have extensive evidence from art, literature, and contemporary accounts that show just how central leg display was to medieval male fashion. The technical aspects of hose production also drove innovations in textile manufacturing. The demand for perfectly fitted, brightly colored leg coverings pushed medieval craftsmen to develop new techniques in cutting, sewing, dyeing, and fitting that influenced clothing production for centuries. The social dynamics around hose wearing were complex and reveal important aspects of medieval masculinity. Unlike modern ideas about male fashion being primarily about function and restraint, medieval men were expected to be decorative, colorful, and attention-grabbing. The idea that bright colors and form-fitting clothes were feminine is a much more recent development. Court culture played a huge role in promoting and spreading hose fashion. Royal courts were essentially fashion laboratories where new styles were developed, tested, and refined before spreading to the broader wealthy population. The competitive nature of court life meant that men were constantly trying to outdo each other with more elaborate, colorful, and expensive hose. The international trade implications of hose fashion were significant. The demand for rare dyes and luxury materials drove trade relationships across Europe and beyond. Merchants would travel thousands of miles to obtain the materials needed to create the most fashionable colors and patterns. The craft guilds that produced hose became some of the most prestigious and wealthy in medieval cities. Master hosiers were highly respected artisans whose skills were in constant demand. The techniques they developed for fitting, dyeing, and decorating hose represented some of the most advanced textile work of the medieval period. Number 4. The poulain craze. We touched on poulains earlier when discussing pointy shoes, but the cultural phenomenon around these shoes was so intense and widespread that it deserves its own deeper examination. The poulain craze wasn't just a fashion trend, it was a social movement that consumed European culture for over 2 centuries and reached levels of extremism that seem almost unbelievable today. The name poulain comes from Poland, where the style supposedly originated, but by the time the trend reached Western Europe, it had evolved into something far more extreme than anything actually worn in Poland. What started as slightly pointed shoes became a full-blown cultural obsession with making shoe toes as long as physically possible. To really understand the poulain craze, you need to picture the social dynamics of medieval cities. These were places where social status was everything, but where rapid economic changes were creating new classes of wealthy people who weren't born into nobility. Merchants, bankers, successful craftsmen, and others were accumulating wealth and trying to climb the social ladder. Polanes became the perfect way for these newly wealthy people to signal their status. Unlike other luxury items that might be hidden away in private homes, shoes were public displays that everyone could see. And unlike subtle signs of wealth that might be missed, polanes were impossible to ignore. The length of your polane toes became a precise indicator of your place in society. There were unwritten but widely understood rules about who could wear what length. Peasants and laborers weren't supposed to wear pointed shoes at all. Merchants and craftsmen could wear modest points. Lesser nobility could wear longer points. And the highest nobility could wear the most extreme lengths. But here's where it gets interesting. These rules were constantly being challenged and pushed. Wealthy merchants would try to wear longer points than their social status technically allowed. Younger sons of noble families would wear extremely long points to compensate for their lower inheritance prospects. The whole system created a constant tension and competition. The construction techniques for extreme polanes were incredibly sophisticated. Shoemakers developed specialized methods for creating and maintaining the long, pointed toes. The longest points were essentially hollow tubes that extended far beyond the foot, carefully shaped and reinforced to maintain their form. Different stuffing materials were used depending on the intended use and the wearer's budget. Basic polanes might be stuffed with straw or moss. Higher-end versions used hair, wool, or even down feathers. The most expensive polanes had internal wire frames or whalebone supports that kept them perfectly shaped and pointed upward at just the right angle. The attachment systems for extreme polanes were engineering marvels in their own right. Chains, cords, or ribbons would connect the toe tips to the wearer's legs at the knee or even higher. These attachment systems had to be both secure enough to prevent the shoes from dragging on the ground and flexible enough to allow some degree of normal movement. The decoration of polanes became an art form. Wealthy wearers would have their shoe toes decorated with intricate embroidery, precious metals, jewels, or carved designs. Some polanes featured miniature sculptures or painted scenes on the extended toes. Others had bells, chimes, or other sound-making devices that would announce the wearer's approach. The social rituals around polanes were elaborate. There were specific ways to walk, sit, and move that were considered proper for someone wearing long-toed shoes. Dance styles were modified to accommodate the shoes. Even greeting rituals had to be adapted. A traditional bow became difficult or impossible in extremely long polanes. Court culture embraced polanes enthusiastically. Royal courts across Europe competed to see who could wear the most extreme versions. Court ceremonies were modified to showcase polane fashion, with special walking patterns and dance forms that would display the shoes to best advantage. The economic impact of the polane craze was enormous. Entire industries developed around producing, maintaining, and accessorizing pointed shoes. Specialized shoemakers, decorators, and even polane maintenance specialists became established professions in major cities. But the trend also created significant social problems. The extreme impracticality of long polanes meant that wearers couldn't perform normal physical activities. This was fine for the truly wealthy who had servants to do everything for them, but it created problems for people who were trying to appear wealthier than they actually were. Stories from the period describe merchants who wore such long polanes that they couldn't actually conduct their business properly, students who couldn't walk to classes, and soldiers who couldn't fight effectively. The shoes became a symbol of a society that valued appearance over practical ability. The religious opposition to polanes was intense and well documented. Church leaders saw the shoes as symbols of vanity, pride, and misplaced priorities. Some compared the pointed toes to devil's horns or claimed they were inspired by demonic influences. There are records of sermons specifically condemning polanes and calling for their abandonment. But the church's opposition may have actually increased the popularity of polanes among certain groups. Wearing obviously impractical and religiously condemned shoes became a way for wealthy lay people to assert their independence from church authority and display their secular power. The government regulations around polanes were extensive and revealed just how seriously authorities took the social disruption caused by the fashion. Laws specified maximum toe lengths for different social classes, with violations subject to fines, imprisonment, or even corporal punishment. Enforcement of these laws was sporadic but sometimes dramatic. There are records of shoe inspections where officials would measure polane toes and arrest violators. Some cities employed official shoe measurers whose job was to ensure compliance with sumptuary laws. The international spread of polane fashion shows how interconnected medieval European culture was becoming. The trend moved from country to country, adapting to local conditions but maintaining its basic extremist character. Trade routes, diplomatic missions, and cultural exchanges all helped spread Polaine fashion across the continent. Different regions developed their own variations on the basic Polaine theme. English Polaines tended to be more conservatively decorated but pushed the limits of length. French versions were often more elaborately adorned but slightly shorter. Italian Polaines integrated classical decorative motifs, while German versions sometimes featured regional cultural symbols. The decline of Polaines came when broader social and cultural changes made their extreme impracticality seem outdated rather than fashionable. The Renaissance brought new ideals about human dignity, practical ability, and a relationship between appearance and function that made Polaines seem foolish rather than sophisticated. But the Polaine craze left lasting impacts on European culture. The shoes became symbols of medieval excess that were referenced in literature and art for centuries. They also established patterns of fashion extremism and status competition that would reappear in different forms throughout European history. The archaeological record for Polaines is extensive, with examples found in excavations across Europe. The variety and craftsmanship of surviving Polaines show just how sophisticated and widespread the trend became. Some of the most elaborate examples are genuine works of art that reveal the skill and creativity of medieval craftsmen. The psychology behind the Polaine craze reveals important aspects of human social behavior. The willingness to accept significant inconvenience and even physical harm in order to display a status is a pattern that appears throughout history. Polaines represent one of the most extreme examples of this tendency. The technological innovations driven by Polaine production had lasting impacts beyond fashion. The techniques developed for shaping, strengthening, and decorating the extended shoe toes influenced leatherworking, metalworking, and textile arts for generations. The cultural memory of Polaines persisted long after the fashion itself died out. References to pointy shoes as symbols of vanity and impracticality appeared in literature, art, and popular culture for centuries afterward, showing how deeply the trend had penetrated European consciousness. Number 5. Deadly long sleeves. While men were dealing with impossible shoes and women were managing architectural hats, everyone was struggling with one of the most dangerous fashion trends in medieval history: sleeves so long they literally killed people. We're talking about sleeves that extended far beyond the hands, sometimes trailing on the ground for several feet, creating beautiful flowing lines that were also incredibly dangerous fire hazards. The long sleeve trend dominated medieval fashion from roughly the 12th to the 15th centuries, appearing on both men's and women's clothing, but reaching its most extreme forms in women's formal wear. These weren't just sleeves that were a little too long, they were architectural elements that fundamentally changed how the wearer could move and interact with the world. To understand just how extreme these sleeves became, imagine trying to eat dinner while wearing sleeves that extend 3 feet beyond your fingertips. Every movement had to be carefully calculated to avoid knocking things over, getting the sleeves dirty, or catching them on objects. The sleeves essentially turned basic human activities into elaborate choreographed performances. The construction of extreme long sleeves was a major technical challenge for medieval tailors. The sleeves had to be cut and sewn in ways that would allow them to hang gracefully while still being attached securely to the garment. The weight distribution had to be carefully calculated so the sleeves wouldn't pull the entire garment out of shape. Different techniques were used to achieve the desired effect. Some sleeves were simply extended versions of normal sleeves, cut from the same fabric as the rest of the garment and sewn in traditional ways. But the most dramatic versions were constructed more like separate garments that were attached to the main dress or tunic. The most extreme long sleeves were essentially fabric tubes that could be 6 feet long or more. These would be attached at the shoulder and allowed to hang freely, creating dramatic trailing effects as the wearer moved. The fabric for these sleeves often differed from the main garment, using lighter materials that would flow more gracefully. But here's where the danger came in: medieval lighting was provided by candles, oil lamps, and open fires. Rooms were often dimly lit with multiple flame sources scattered around. Long, flowing sleeves were constantly at risk of brushing against these flames, and when they caught fire, the results were often catastrophic. The historical records contain numerous accounts of deaths caused by sleeve fires. Women would be sitting at dinner, reaching for food or drink, when their sleeves would pass too close to candles and instantly ignite. The loose, flowing fabric would burn quickly, and once the fire started, it was very difficult to extinguish. The problem was made worse by the fact that many of the fabrics used for long sleeves were particularly flammable. Silk, fine linen, and other luxury materials would burn rapidly once ignited. Some fabrics were treated with various substances to improve their appearance or drape, and these treatments sometimes made them even more combustible. The social dynamics around long sleeves were complex. Like other extreme fashion trends, they were primarily a way to display wealth and status. If you could afford to wear sleeves that made practical activities impossible, that meant you were wealthy enough to have servants do everything for you. The sleeves also created a specific aesthetic ideal that was considered highly attractive in medieval culture. The flowing lines and graceful movement of long sleeves were seen as feminine and elegant. Women would practice specific movements and gestures designed to show off their sleeves to best advantage. Court culture embraced long sleeves enthusiastically. Royal and noble women competed to wear the most extreme versions, and court ceremonies were designed to showcase sleeve fashion. Special dance forms and walking patterns were developed that would create beautiful visual effects with flowing sleeves. But the practical problems went far beyond just fire danger. Long sleeves made eating a major challenge. Special techniques had to be developed for managing sleeves while dining, and servants often had to help hold or arrange the sleeves during meals. Some wealthy women employed specialists, whose primary job was sleeve management during social functions. The maintenance requirements for long sleeves were enormous. The trailing ends would collect dirt, dust, and debris from floors and surfaces. They required constant cleaning and repair. Many garments with extreme long sleeves could only be worn a few times before the sleeves became too damaged or dirty to be presentable. The construction costs for garments with extreme long sleeves were much higher than normal clothing. Not only did they require much more fabric, but the specialized cutting and sewing techniques needed to make them properly meant that only the most skilled and expensive tailors could produce them. Different social classes had different versions of long sleeves that reflected their economic status and social position. The nobility might have sleeves made from expensive imported silks that trailed several feet behind them. Wealthy merchants might have more modest versions that still extended well beyond the hands but weren't quite as extreme. The church's reaction to long sleeves was predictably negative, but for different reasons than their opposition to other fashion trends. While they condemned the vanity and expense of extreme sleeves, they were also concerned about the practical problems they caused during religious ceremonies. Women wearing long sleeves couldn't participate properly in church services. They couldn't kneel without their sleeves spreading across the floor, couldn't make proper gestures during prayer, and couldn't handle prayer books or other religious objects effectively. Some churches began requiring that women pin up or tie back their sleeves during services. The fire danger from long sleeves was so well known that specific etiquette rules developed around managing them safely. Women were taught to always keep their sleeves away from candles and fires, to move slowly and deliberately to avoid accidents, and to have servants nearby who could help if problems arose. Some households employed servants whose specific job was fire safety related to clothing. These servants would follow their mistresses around during evening events, watching for situations where sleeves might come too close to flames and intervening if necessary. Despite the dangers, long sleeves remained popular for centuries because the risks were seen as acceptable trade-offs for the status and beauty they provided. The same mindset that led people to wear dangerous pointed shoes or towering hats also applied to potentially deadly sleeves. The technical innovations developed to make long sleeves safer and more practical had broader impacts on medieval clothing design. New attachment methods, weight distribution techniques, and fabric treatments developed for sleeves were applied to other areas of fashion. Regional variations in long sleeve styles reflected local climate, culture, and social conditions. Northern European versions tended to be made from heavier fabrics that provided some protection from cold weather, while Southern European styles used lighter materials that emphasized graceful movement. The artistic and cultural impact of long sleeves extended beyond fashion. The flowing lines created by extreme sleeves influenced painting, sculpture, and decorative arts. Artists would exaggerate sleeve lengths even further in their work to create more dramatic visual effects. The decline of extreme long sleeves came gradually as Renaissance ideas about practicality and human dignity began to influence fashion. The new ideals emphasized the importance of being able to function effectively in the world, which made obviously impractical clothing seem foolish rather than fashionable. But the memory of deadly long sleeves persisted in European culture for centuries. Stories about women dying in sleeve fires became cautionary tales about the dangers of vanity and excessive fashion. The trend became a symbol of medieval impracticality and the lengths people would go to for status display. Archaeological evidence for long sleeves is limited because textiles rarely preserve well, but we have extensive documentation from contemporary sources that show just how widespread and extreme the trend became. Account books from wealthy households show the enormous costs associated with maintaining garments with extreme sleeves. The social psychology behind long sleeves reveals important aspects of medieval attitudes toward gender, status, and risk. The willingness of women to accept significant danger in order to conform to fashion expectations shows how powerful social pressure could be in medieval society. Number 6. Shaved foreheads for beauty. Now we need to talk about one of the most bizarre beauty trends in medieval history. Women deliberately shaving off their hair to create unnaturally high and wide foreheads. This wasn't just a little hair removal around a hairline. We're talking about women removing several inches of hair from the front and sides of their heads to achieve a look that would seem completely alien to modern eyes. The shaved forehead trend, also known as forehead plucking, dominated European beauty standards from roughly the 14th to the early 16th centuries. During this time, high wide forehead was considered the ultimate sign of feminine beauty and intelligence. The bigger your forehead looked, the more attractive and sophisticated you were considered. But achieving this look required extreme measures. Women would use tweezers, small knives, or even primitive razors to remove not just their hairline, but often their eyebrows as well. The goal was to create a smooth, unbroken expanse of skin from the top of the head down to the eyes. The process was incredibly painful and time-consuming. Hair removal had to be done regularly as the hair grew back, and the tools available were crude and often caused cuts, infections, and permanent scarring. Many women would spend hours each week maintaining their artificially enlarged foreheads. To understand why women would put themselves through this, you need to understand medieval ideas about beauty and intelligence. A high forehead was thought to indicate superior mental capacity and moral character. The idea was that a larger forehead meant a larger brain, which meant greater intelligence and wisdom. This belief was reinforced by religious and philosophical ideas that associated physical beauty with spiritual virtue. A woman with a high, clear forehead was seen as more pure, more noble, and more worthy of respect than one with a lower hairline. The fashion was also influenced by classical ideals that were being rediscovered during the Renaissance. Ancient Greek and Roman art often depicted gods and goddesses with high foreheads, and medieval people tried to emulate these classical standards of beauty. But the shaved forehead trend went far beyond just removing hair. Women would also use various techniques to make their foreheads appear even larger and more prominent. Some would use white face paint or powder to make the forehead more visible and luminous. Others would apply special oils or treatments that were supposed to prevent hair regrowth. The most extreme practitioners would remove not just their hairlines and eyebrows, but also their eyelashes and any other facial hair. The goal was to create a completely smooth, hairless face dominated by an enormous forehead. The social implications of forehead shaving were complex. Like other extreme beauty practices, it was primarily available to wealthy women who had the time, money, and servants necessary to maintain such an unnatural look. Poor women couldn't afford the tools, treatments, and time required for regular hair removal. The practice also reinforced gender roles in medieval society. Men were not expected to shave their foreheads. In fact, male beauty standards emphasized full heads of hair and beards. The forehead shaving trend was specifically feminine and emphasized the idea that women's value lay in their appearance rather than their practical abilities. Court culture played a major role in spreading and maintaining the forehead shaving trend. Noble women at royal courts competed to achieve the most extreme foreheads, and court artists and fashion advisors developed increasingly sophisticated techniques for hair removal and forehead enhancement. The maintenance requirements for shaved foreheads were enormous. The hair removal process had to be repeated frequently, often several times per week. The skin required special care to prevent infection and scarring. Many women employed servants whose primary job was forehead maintenance. Special tools were developed specifically for forehead shaving. These included delicate tweezers made from precious metals, small knives designed for precise hair removal, and various potions and treatments that were supposed to slow hair regrowth or improve the appearance of the skin. The pain and health risks associated with forehead shaving were significant. The constant hair removal caused irritation, infection, and permanent damage to hair follicles. Some women developed chronic skin conditions or scarring that lasted for life. But perhaps most bizarrely, the forehead shaving trend was often combined with other extreme beauty practices. Women with shaved foreheads would also pluck their eyebrows into thin, high arches, remove their eyelashes, and sometimes even remove hair from other parts of their faces. The result was a look that seems almost inhuman to modern eyes. Women with massive, bald foreheads, no eyebrows or eyelashes, and unnaturally pale, smooth skin. Combined with the elaborate headdresses and makeup of the period, the overall effect was dramatic and artificial. The church's reaction to forehead shaving was mixed. Some religious leaders condemned it as vanity in an attempt to improve upon God's creation. But others saw the high forehead as a sign of spiritual purity and actually encouraged the practice among devout women. The medical community of the time had various theories about forehead shaving. Some physicians believed that removing hair from the forehead improved health by allowing the brain to breathe better. Others warned that the practice could cause illness or mental problems. Regional variations in forehead shaving practices were significant. Italian women tended to create more modest alterations to their hairlines, while French and Burgundian women pushed the practice to more extreme levels. English women often combined forehead shaving with elaborate headdresses that further emphasized the enlarged forehead. The decline of forehead shaving came gradually as Renaissance ideals about natural beauty began to influence fashion. The new emphasis on harmony and proportion made the extremely artificial look created by forehead shaving seem outdated and unattractive. But the practice persisted in some form for centuries. Even as extreme forehead shaving went out of fashion, many women continued to pluck or shave their hairlines to create slightly higher foreheads. The basic idea that a high forehead was attractive remained influential long after the most extreme practices ended. The cultural impact of forehead shaving extended beyond just beauty practices. The trend influenced art, literature, and even architecture. Artists would often exaggerate forehead size in their portraits, and the high forehead became a standard feature in depictions of beautiful women. The social psychology behind forehead shaving reveals important aspects of medieval attitudes toward beauty, gender, and social status. The willingness of women to undergo painful and dangerous procedures to achieve an artificial standard of beauty shows how powerful social pressure could be in medieval society. Archaeological evidence for forehead shaving practices is limited, but we have extensive documentation from contemporary sources including medical texts, beauty manuals, and personal accounts. These sources reveal just how widespread and accepted the practice became among wealthy women. The technical aspects of forehead shaving drove innovations in toolmaking and cosmetic preparation that influenced beauty practices for centuries. The specialized instruments and treatments developed for hair removal were adapted for other beauty procedures and helped establish the foundations of the modern cosmetics industry. The international spread of forehead shaving practices shows how interconnected medieval European culture was becoming. Fashion trends, beauty ideals, and social practices moved easily from court to court and country to country through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Number 7. Codpieces, the fashion statement for men. Now we need to discuss what might be the most shocking and bizarre aspect of medieval men's fashion, the codpiece. This was a decorative covering for men's genitals that wasn't just functional underwear, but an elaborate fashion statement designed to draw attention to and exaggerate the male anatomy. We're talking about padded, decorated, often enormous fabric or leather pouches that men wore prominently displayed on the outside of their clothing. The codpiece emerged in the 15th century and reached its peak of popularity in the 16th century. What started as a practical solution to a clothing problem quickly evolved into one of the most outrageous fashion trends in European history. Men would wear codpieces that were decorated with jewels, embroidery, ribbons, and other ornaments, making them the focal point of their entire outfit. To understand how codpieces developed, you need to know about changes in men's clothing during this period. Earlier medieval men had worn long tunics that covered everything from chest to knees. But by the 15th century, fashion was moving toward shorter tunics and tighter-fitting clothes that showed more of the body's shape. The problem was that men were also wearing hose, those tight, colorful leg coverings we discussed earlier. Hose were essentially individual stockings that came up to the waist, but they had a gap in the crotch area that was originally covered by the long tunic. As tunics got shorter, this gap became visible and needed to be covered somehow. The codpiece was the solution. Initially, it was just a simple triangular piece of fabric that tied or buttoned into place to cover the gap between the hose. But like every other aspect of medieval fashion, it What started as a practical necessity quickly became an opportunity for elaborate display and status competition. By the early 16th century, codpieces had evolved into major fashion statements. They were made from expensive materials like silk, velvet, or fine leather. They were padded and shaped to create exaggerated bulges that bore little resemblance to actual human anatomy. They were decorated with embroidery, jewels, ribbons, and other ornaments that made them impossible to ignore. The size of codpieces became increasingly extreme. What started as modest coverings evolved into enormous protrusions that extended several inches from the body. Some codpieces were so large that they affected how men could walk, sit, or move through doorways. The social implications of codpieces were complex and reveal important aspects of medieval masculinity. In a culture where displaying wealth and status through clothing was essential, the codpiece became a way for men to make their most private parts into public statements of power and prosperity. The decoration and construction of codpieces became an art form. Skilled craftsmen specialized in creating elaborate codpieces that were essentially sculptural works. Some featured intricate embroidery depicting scenes from mythology or heraldry. Others were decorated with precious metals, gems, or pearls that made them more valuable than most people's entire wardrobes. The most extreme codpieces were designed to be functional as well as decorative. Some had pockets or compartments where men could store small items like coins or jewelry. Others had hidden openings that allowed for practical use without requiring removal of the entire apparatus. Court culture embraced codpieces enthusiastically. Royal courts across Europe became laboratories for developing increasingly elaborate and outrageous codpiece designs. Nobles would compete to wear the most impressive codpieces, and court ceremonies often feature displays of codpiece fashion. The international spread of codpiece fashion shows how connected European culture had become. Styles and innovations would travel from court to court, with each region developing its own variations on the basic theme. Italian codpieces tended to be more artistically decorated, while German versions often emphasized size and bulk. The religious and moral reaction to codpieces was predictably negative. Church leaders condemned them as indecent displays of pride and lust. Some preachers argued that codpieces were inspired by the devil and were leading men into sin and corruption. But the religious opposition may have actually increased the popularity of codpieces among certain groups. Wearing an obviously sexual and religiously condemned garment became a way for wealthy men to assert their independence from church authority and display their secular power. The practical problems associated with wearing codpieces were significant. The large, rigid structures made many normal activities difficult or impossible. Men couldn't sit comfortably, couldn't bend over easily, and had to modify their walking and movement patterns to accommodate their bulky accessories. The maintenance requirements for elaborate codpieces were considerable. The padding had to be kept in shape, the decorations required regular cleaning and repair, and the attachment systems needed constant adjustment. Many wealthy men employed servants whose job included codpiece maintenance. The construction techniques for codpieces drove innovations in tailoring, padding, and decoration that influenced men's fashion for centuries. The methods developed for creating and maintaining complex three-dimensional garment structures were adapted for other areas of clothing design. The codpiece also influenced other aspects of medieval and Renaissance culture. The prominent display of exaggerated male anatomy appeared in art, literature, and decorative objects. Artists would often emphasize codpieces in their portraits of wealthy men, and the accessories became symbols of masculine power and status. Different social classes had access to different levels of codpiece elaboration. The nobility could afford codpieces made from the finest materials and decorated with the most expensive ornaments. Wealthy merchants and craftsmen wore more modest versions that still signaled their prosperity. Poor men couldn't afford codpieces at all and had to make do with simpler solutions to the clothing gap problem. The decline of codpiece fashion came gradually in the late 16th and early 17th centuries as ideas about masculine display began to change. The Protestant Reformation brought new ideals about modesty and restraint that made obvious sexual display seem inappropriate rather than fashionable. But the cultural impact of codpieces persisted long after the fashion itself died out. The accessories became symbols of masculine excess and vanity that were referenced in literature and art for centuries. They also established patterns of male display culture that would reappear in different forms throughout European history. The archaeological record for codpieces is limited because they were made mostly from organic materials that don't preserve well. But we have extensive documentation from paintings, written records, and contemporary accounts that show just how widespread and elaborate the trend became. The social psychology behind codpieces reveals important aspects of medieval and Renaissance attitudes toward masculinity, sexuality, and power. The willingness of men to wear such obviously sexual displays shows how different historical concepts of appropriate masculine behavior could be from modern ideas. The economic impact of codpiece fashion was significant. Entire industries developed around producing, decorating, and maintaining the accessories. Specialized craftsmen, artists, and tailors built their careers on codpiece design and construction. The codpiece also played a role in the development of modern men's underwear and fashion. The techniques developed for creating supportive, shaped garments for the male anatomy influenced underwear design for centuries. The basic concept of using clothing to enhance and display masculine attributes continues in various forms today. Number 8. Bright and clashing colors. While we've touched on colorful clothing in earlier segments, we need to dive deeper into just how extreme medieval color combinations really were. We're not just talking about wearing bright colors, we're talking about deliberate color clashing on a level that would hurt your eyes. Rich medieval people would intentionally wear the most jarring, shocking color combinations possible because the ability to afford multiple vivid dyes was the ultimate status symbol. Picture walking down a medieval street and seeing a wealthy merchant wearing bright red pants, a sunshine yellow tunic, electric blue sleeves, and a vivid green cloak, all in the most saturated, eye-searing shades possible. This wasn't considered garish or tasteless. This was high fashion. The more your outfit looked like a rainbow explosion, the more fashionable you were considered. The medieval obsession with clashing colors developed because producing vivid dyes was incredibly expensive and technically challenging. Each bright color represented a significant investment of time, money, and resources. Wearing multiple bright colors simultaneously was essentially wearing your entire wealth on your body in the most obvious way possible. Red dyes were among the most expensive and prized. True crimson came from crushed cochineal insects that had to be imported from distant lands. Bright scarlet required cinnabar, a mercury compound that was both rare and dangerous to work with. Deep purple came from murex shells and could cost more than gold by weight. Blue presented its own challenges. The most prized blues came from lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone that had to be ground into powder and processed through complex chemical treatments. Indigo, imported from India through dangerous and expensive trade routes, provided another source of blue dye that was almost as costly as precious metals. Green dyes were created through complex processes that often involved multiple stages and different base materials. The most vivid greens required combinations of different dyes applied in specific sequences. Yellow came from saffron, which was literally worth more than its weight in gold, or from other expensive imported materials. But here's where it gets really wild. Medieval fashion didn't just use these expensive colors, it used them in the most contrasting combinations possible. The goal wasn't harmony or subtlety. It was maximum visual impact. Rich people wanted their clothing to be visible from across a crowded marketplace, and the best way to achieve that was through shocking color combinations. The most fashionable outfit might combine bright red with electric green, sunshine yellow with deep purple, or vivid orange with brilliant blue. These weren't accidental combinations, they were carefully planned to create the most dramatic visual effect possible. Fashion advisors and court artists would spend considerable time planning color combinations that would be both shocking and beautiful. The party color trend took this concept even further. A single garment would be made from multiple contrasting colors, often split down the middle or divided into complex geometric patterns. The tunic might be half red and half blue, with yellow sleeves and a green hood. Hose would be different colors on each leg, creating a walking rainbow effect. The social rules around color combinations were complex and strictly enforced. Certain color combinations were reserved for specific social classes or occasions. Royal purple could only be worn by royalty. Specific shades of red were restricted to the nobility. Even wealthy merchants had to be careful not to wear color combinations that were above their social station. The church had mixed reactions to extreme color combinations. While some religious leaders condemned bright colors as vanity and worldly display, others embraced them as expressions of divine beauty and glory. Church vestments often feature the most elaborate and expensive color combinations available. Court culture drove much of the innovation in color combination fashion. Royal courts became laboratories for developing new and more shocking color combinations. Court artists and fashion advisors would compete to create the most dramatic and memorable outfits for their royal patrons. The international trade implications of color fashion were enormous. The demand for rare dyes drove trade relationships across the known world. Merchants would travel thousands of miles and risk their lives to obtain the materials needed to create the most fashionable colors. The technical challenges of creating and maintaining bright, clashing colors were significant. Many dyes were unstable and would fade or change color over time. Others were incompatible with certain fabrics or would damage the material. Dyers developed complex techniques for fixing colors and preventing fading. The regional variations in color fashion reflected local resources and trade connections. Areas with access to certain dye sources developed their own characteristic color palettes. Italian fashion tended toward more sophisticated color combinations, while Northern European styles often emphasized bold contrasts. The social psychology behind extreme color combinations reveals important aspects of medieval attitudes toward display and status. The willingness to wear obviously artificial and expensive color combinations was a way of demonstrating distance from practical concerns and natural limitations. The decline of extreme color clashing came gradually as Renaissance ideas about harmony and proportion began to influence fashion. The new ideals emphasized balance and subtlety over shocking display, making jarring color combinations seem crude rather than sophisticated. But the impact of medieval color fashion persisted in various forms. The association between bright colors and wealth remained influential for centuries. The techniques developed for creating and combining different dyes laid the foundation for the modern textile industry. The archaeological evidence for medieval color practices is limited because dyes often fade over time. But we have extensive documentation from contemporary sources including account books, trade records, and sumptuary laws that show just how important and expensive color was in medieval society. The economic impact of color fashion was significant. Entire industries developed around producing, importing, and processing dyes. The search for new and better dye sources drove exploration and trade expansion across the medieval world. The artistic influence of extreme color combinations extended beyond fashion. Medieval art, architecture, and decorative objects all reflected the same preference for bold, contrasting colors. The visual culture of the medieval period was characterized by the same shocking color combinations that appeared in fashion. Number 9. Wigs made of strange materials. Now we need to discuss one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval fashion, the materials people used to create artificial hair. We're not just talking about wigs made from other people's hair, though that was certainly common. We're talking about wigs made from sheep's wool, horsehair, goat fur, and yes, even hair taken from corpses. The medieval wig industry was a bizarre world where anything that could be shaped into something resembling hair might end up on someone's head. The wig trend in medieval Europe developed for both practical and fashionable reasons. Many people suffer from hair loss due to disease, poor nutrition, or medical treatments. But beyond medical necessity, wigs became fashion accessories that allowed people to achieve hairstyles that would have been impossible with their natural hair. The most basic wigs were made from human hair, usually purchased from poor people who sold their hair for money. Hair merchants would travel through rural areas buying hair from peasant women, who would cut off their long braids in exchange for coins. This hair would then be processed and turned into wigs for wealthy customers. But human hair was expensive and sometimes hard to obtain in the quantities needed for elaborate wigs. This led wig makers to experiment with other materials that could be processed to look like hair. Sheep's wool was one of the most common alternatives, especially when it came from certain breeds that produced particularly fine, silky fleeces. The process of turning sheep's wool into convincing fake hair was complex and time-consuming. The wool had to be carefully cleaned, treated with various chemicals to change its texture, and then dyed to achieve realistic hair colors. Skilled craftsmen developed techniques for making wool wigs that were almost indistinguishable from real hair. Horsehair presented different challenges and opportunities for wig makers. Horsehair was naturally closer to human hair in texture and appearance, but it was coarser and more difficult to work with. The best horsehair came from the manes and tails of young, healthy horses, and this could be quite expensive to obtain. Goat hair was another popular wig material, especially hair from certain breeds of goats that produced particularly fine, soft fur. Angora goats were especially prized for wig making because their hair could be processed to achieve a silky texture that resembled expensive human hair. But perhaps most disturbingly, medieval wig makers also used hair taken from corpses. When wealthy people died, Their hair would sometimes be harvested and sold to wig makers. This practice was considered normal and practical. The dead person no longer needed their hair, and it could provide valuable material for wigs. The hair of dead people was actually considered superior for wig making in some ways. It was usually clean and well-maintained, since wealthy people took better care of their hair, and it came in long lengths that were perfect for creating elaborate hairstyles. Some wig makers specialized in working with hair obtained from corpses. The social implications of wearing wigs made from unusual materials were complex. On one hand, a good wig could help someone achieve fashionable hairstyles and cover up hair loss or damage. On the other hand, there was always the risk that someone might discover what your wig was really made from, which could be socially embarrassing. The construction techniques for wigs made from non-human materials were sophisticated and innovative. Wig makers developed methods for processing different types of hair and fur to make them look and feel as much like human hair as possible. They experimented with different treatments, dyes, and styling techniques. The maintenance requirements for unusual material wigs were often more demanding than for human hair wigs. Sheep's wool wigs required special care to prevent them from becoming matted or returning to their original woolly texture. Horsehair wigs needed different cleaning and styling techniques than human hair. The church's reaction to wigs made from strange materials was generally negative, but for interesting reasons. While they objected to vanity and artificial beauty in general, they were particularly disturbed by the use of hair from corpses, which they saw as disrespectful to the dead. The regional variations in wig materials reflected local resources and traditions. Areas with large sheep populations naturally developed expertise in wool wigs. Regions with horse breeding industries had access to better horsehair for wig making. Coastal areas sometimes used seaweed or other marine materials in wig construction. The quality differences between wigs made from different materials were significant. The best human hair wigs were almost indistinguishable from natural hair and could last for years with proper care. Wool wigs were cheaper but required more maintenance and had a more obviously artificial appearance. The international trade in wig materials was extensive. Human hair was imported from regions where people were willing to sell it cheaply. Exotic animal hairs were traded across long distances. Even hair from corpses was sometimes exported from areas where it was abundant to regions where it was scarce. The artistic aspects of unusual material wig making drove innovations in textile processing and hairstyling that influenced other crafts. The techniques developed for processing and shaping different types of hair and fur were adapted for other uses in fashion and decorative arts. The social psychology behind wearing wigs made from strange materials reveals important aspects of medieval attitudes toward beauty, death, and social status. The willingness to wear hair from dead animals or even dead people shows how different medieval concepts of appropriate fashion could be from modern ideas. The medical theories about wigs and hair health were often bizarre by modern standards. Some physicians believed that wearing certain types of animal hair could transfer the animal's characteristics to the wearer. Others thought that hair from corpses could carry spiritual or physical contamination. The decline of unusual material wigs came gradually as techniques for processing human hair improved and became more affordable. The Renaissance brought new ideas about natural beauty that made obviously artificial wigs seem less fashionable. But the impact of medieval wig innovation persisted in various forms. The techniques developed for processing different materials influenced the development of the modern wig industry. Many of the basic methods for cleaning, treating, and styling artificial hair can be traced back to medieval innovations. The archaeological evidence for unusual material wigs is limited because organic materials rarely preserve well. But we have extensive documentation from contemporary sources including account books, trade records, and medical texts that show just how widespread and accepted these practices were. The economic impact of the unusual material wig trade was significant. Entire industries developed around collecting, processing, and selling different types of hair and fur for wig making. The demand for wig materials drove trade and commerce across medieval Europe. Number 10, the higher the hat, the richer you looked. Finally, we need to talk about the ultimate expression of medieval fashion excess, hats that were so tall they turned their wearers into walking architectural projects. We're talking about hats that could reach heights of 3 feet or more, creating silhouettes so extreme that people literally couldn't fit through doorways without removing their headwear or crawling on their hands and knees. The tall hat trend dominated European fashion from the 14th through the 16th centuries, with different styles appearing in different regions and time periods. But the basic principle remained constant. The taller your hat, the wealthier and more important you were considered to be. This led to an escalating arms race of hat height that reached absolutely ridiculous proportions. The most famous of these extreme hats was the hennin, which we discussed earlier, but there were many other styles that pushed the limits of height and impracticality. Sugarloaf hats resembled giant ice cream cones. Steeple headdresses looked like church spires. Butterfly headdresses spread out horizontally as well as vertically, creating silhouettes that were wider than the wearer's shoulders. The construction of extremely tall hats was an engineering challenge that pushed medieval craftsmanship to its limits. The basic structure was usually built around a framework of wire, wood, or whalebone that provided the shape and support. This framework was then covered with expensive fabrics and decorated with elaborate ornaments. The tallest hats required internal reinforcement systems that were essentially architectural in nature. Support struts, tension wires, and counterbalancing weights were used to keep the structure stable and prevent them from toppling over. Some of the most elaborate hats weighed several pounds and required neck muscles developed through years of practice to wear comfortably. The social rules around hat height were strict and complex. Different heights were appropriate for different social classes, and wearing a hat that was too tall for your station could result in legal punishment. Sumptuary laws in many cities specified exact height limits for different social classes. The practical problems with extremely tall hats were enormous. Wearers couldn't walk through normal doorways, couldn't ride in carriages, and couldn't participate in many normal activities without special accommodations. Architecture had to be modified to accommodate the fashion. Some churches and public buildings actually raised their doorways to allow people wearing tall hats to enter. The wind presented constant challenges for tall hat wearers. A strong gust could knock someone over or send their expensive hat flying. Special techniques had to be developed for walking and moving in windy conditions. Some hat wearers employed servants whose job was to hold and steady their hats during outdoor activities. The cost of extremely tall hats was astronomical. The materials alone, rare fabrics, precious metals, jewels, and exotic decorations, could cost more than a house. The skilled craftsmanship required to construct and maintain these architectural headpieces meant that only the wealthiest people could afford them. Different regions developed their own variations on the tall hat theme. Burgundian hats were often the tallest and most elaborate, reflecting the wealth and extravagance of the Burgundian court. French versions emphasized elegance and refinement. English tall hats were often more conservative, but still substantial enough to clearly signal high status. The international competition around hat height became a form of diplomatic display. When nobles from different countries met, the height and elaborateness of their hats became a way of showing their nation's wealth and power. Court ceremonies were often planned around displaying the most impressive hats. The maintenance requirements for extremely tall hats were significant. They had to be stored in special boxes or rooms to protect their shape. The decorations required regular cleaning and repair. Many wealthy families employed specialists whose only job was maintaining and caring for the family's collection of tall hats. The church's reaction to extremely tall hats was particularly intense because the hats caused so many problems in religious settings. Women couldn't kneel properly for prayer, couldn't fit into confession booths, and sometimes knocked over candles or other religious objects with their towering headwear. Some churches banned tall hats entirely, while others required that they be removed during services. This created social problems because removing an expensive hat defeated much of the purpose of wearing it, but refusing to remove it could be seen as disrespectful to religious authority. The medical implications of wearing extremely tall hats were significant. The weight could cause neck strain and headaches. The poor balance could lead to falls and injuries. Some physicians at the time warned that tall hats could cause brain damage by pressing down on the skull, though this was based on incorrect understanding of anatomy. The psychological effects of extreme hat height were also notable. Wearers had to completely modify their behavior and posture to accommodate their headwear. They couldn't move naturally, couldn't look up or down easily, and had to be constantly aware of their surroundings to avoid damaging their expensive hats. The decline of extremely tall hats came as Renaissance ideas about proportion and human dignity began to influence fashion. The new ideals emphasized the importance of natural human proportions and made obviously artificial alterations to the body's silhouette seem crude rather than sophisticated. But the cultural impact of tall hats persisted for centuries. They became symbols of medieval excess and impracticality, referenced in literature and art as examples of vanity and misplaced priorities. The phrase high hat still refers to snobbery and pretension today. The technological innovations driven by tall hat construction had impacts beyond fashion. The engineering techniques developed for creating stable, lightweight, tall structures influenced architecture and mechanical design. The methods for working with exotic materials and creating complex decorative schemes influenced other crafts and arts. The social psychology behind extremely tall hats reveals important aspects of human nature and status competition. The willingness to accept such extreme inconvenience and expense in order to display social position shows how powerful the drive for status can be. So after diving deep into these 10 bizarre fashion trends from the Middle Ages, what can we learn about medieval people and maybe about ourselves? These weren't just weird historical curiosities. They reveal something fundamental about how humans compete for status and express identity through clothing. Every single one of these trends share the same basic logic. The more impractical and expensive your clothing, the higher your social status. If you could afford to wear shoes that made walking difficult, sleeves that were fire hazards, or hats so tall you couldn't fit through doors, that proved you were wealthy enough that practical concerns didn't matter to you. This kind of conspicuous consumption might seem crazy to us, but it's really not that different from modern luxury goods. Think about designer handbags that cost thousands of dollars, sports cars that are impractical for daily driving, or designer shoes that prioritize appearance over comfort. The specific forms change, but the basic human impulse to display status through impractical luxury remains the same. The medieval period was also a time of rapid social change. Old feudal hierarchies were breaking down, new merchant classes were gaining wealth and power, and people needed ways to signal their changing status. Fashion became a battlefield where social position was fought over and displayed. The extremism of medieval fashion also shows how powerful social pressure can be. When your entire social identity depends on wearing the right clothes, people will endure incredible discomfort, expense, and even danger to conform. The fear of appearing lower class was so strong that people would literally risk their lives for fashion. But perhaps most importantly, these trends show that what seems normal to one generation can seem completely insane to the next. The medieval people wearing 3-foot-long shoe toes thought they looked sophisticated and fashionable. To them, our modern clothing probably would have seemed boring and low status. Fashion has always been about more than just covering the body. It's been a language for communicating identity, status, wealth, and values. The medieval period just happened to speak this language in particularly extreme and dramatic ways. The fact that these trends lasted for centuries also shows how persistent social pressure can be. Even when fashion was obviously dangerous or impractical, it continued because the social benefits outweighed the personal costs. Being fashionable was literally more important than being comfortable or safe. These medieval fashion trends also reveal the incredible creativity and craftsmanship of period. The engineering required to make 3-foot-tall hats that wouldn't fall over, or shoes with 2-foot extensions that could still be walked in, or sleeves 6 feet long that would drape gracefully, these were genuine technical achievements that required skill and innovation. The international spread of these fashion trends shows how connected medieval Europe was becoming. Ideas, styles, and techniques traveled from court to court and country to country through trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Fashion was already becoming a global phenomenon. The opposition these trends faced from churches and government shows that even in the medieval period, there were people who thought fashion had gone too far. The same debates we have today about appropriate dress, the influence of fashion on society, and the balance between individual expression and social norms were already happening centuries ago. Looking at medieval fashion also reminds us that beauty standards and fashion ideals are completely cultural and temporary. The medieval preference for extremely high foreheads, the ideal of impossibly long sleeves, the attraction of brightly clashing colors, these all seem natural and obvious to the people of the time but seem alien to us now. This should make us think about our own fashion choices and beauty standards. The things we consider normal and attractive today will probably seem just as weird to future generations as medieval fashion seems to us. Fashion is always temporary, always changing, and always reflects the specific values and conditions of its time. The medieval fashion trends we've explored also show the dark side of status competition. When social position depends on display, it creates enormous pressure on people to spend money they don't have on things they don't need. Many medieval families bankrupted themselves trying to keep up with fashion trends, just like people today might go into debt for designer clothes or luxury goods. But these trends also show the positive side of human creativity and self-expression. Even when constrained by social rules and practical limitations, people found ways to be creative, artistic, and individual through their clothing choices. The elaborate decorations, Innovative construction techniques and artistic vision that went into medieval fashion were genuine expressions of human creativity. The craftspeople who created these extreme fashions were artists and engineers who pushed the boundaries of what was possible with the materials and techniques available to them. Their innovations influenced not just fashion, but also other areas of art, technology, and culture. The medieval fashion trends we've discussed also remind us that humans have always been willing to suffer for beauty and status. The idea that people today are uniquely obsessed with appearance or uniquely willing to endure discomfort for fashion is simply not true. If anything, modern fashion is relatively practical and comfortable compared to what medieval people put themselves through. These historical examples also show us that fashion regulation and criticism are nothing new. Governments have always tried to control how people dress, churches have always condemned vanity and excess, and social critics have always complained about the latest fashion trends. The specific issues change, but the basic conflicts remain the same. Understanding medieval fashion also helps us appreciate the freedom we have today. While we might complain about social pressure to dress certain ways, we have far more choices and far fewer restrictions than medieval people did. We can wear comfortable, practical clothing without facing legal punishment or social ostracism. At the same time, these historical examples remind us that fashion will always be about more than just practicality. Humans are social creatures who use clothing to communicate identity, status, creativity, and values. The specific ways we do this change over time, but the basic human need to express ourselves through appearance remains constant. The medieval fashion trends we've explored were extreme, but they were also human. They show people trying to navigate complex social situations, express their identities, compete for status, and create beauty in their world. The methods might seem crazy to us, but the underlying motivations are universal and timeless. These trends also remind us to be humble about our own fashion choices. What seems perfectly normal and reasonable to us today will probably seem just as bizarre to future generations as medieval fashion seems to us now. Fashion is always a product of its time, and every generation thinks their way of dressing makes perfect sense. Finally, studying medieval fashion gives us perspective on modern fashion and consumer culture. The same impulses that drove medieval people to wear impossibly long shoes and 3-foot-tall hats are still with us today. Understanding how these impulses played out in the past can help us make more conscious choices about how we engage with fashion and status competition in our own lives. The story of medieval fashion is ultimately a story about human nature, social competition, creativity, and the eternal human desire to express identity through appearance. These bizarre trends might make us laugh or cringe, but they also connect us to our ancestors and remind us that the fundamental human experiences of wanting to belong, to stand out, and to be seen as valuable and important haven't changed at all. If you want to see more weird historical trends that will blow your mind, hit that subscribe button.